Hello, InfectoCast crew, and welcome to another episode. This is William speaking with you.
This is Jordan speaking.
This is Joan speaking. Today's episode is actually a special one because we're basically going to bring you information about something new that's been circulating out there. We're recording this episode in January 2026, and for those following the news, there have been some confirmed cases in Asia of a virus called Nipah virus. Because this virus has pandemic potential and is very important in this context of epidemiological alert for a pandemic, it's already a topic that is causing a lot of public concern and alarm. And for us infectious disease specialists, this is a really interesting topic that we don't know how things will develop from here on out. In fact, I even wonder how this specific episode will age over time. However, this topic of this virus, the Nipah virus, I myself had already read about it before, studied it before, listened to some podcasts about it before. It's a topic that, regardless whether we're going to see a more specific impact, something that will directly affect us here in Brazil, it's still a very interesting topic to explore. So stay with us because we're going to talk all about this virus, Nipah virus. And the first point is this. Why are we talking about a virus that has had outbreaks in Asia since the 1990s, right? Jordan, what are we afraid of? Why are we worried about a virus that's so far away? Exactly.
Should we worry about this right now?
Or not. Man, I know as much as you do just what's in the news, right? But of course, we're here, we went to study, read a bit more about the subject. That's what's both cool and challenging about being an infectious disease specialist. But I think a lot of the concern, William, comes from the recent trauma of the COVID pandemic, right? Because we've already had some outbreaks of this same virus at other times, haven't we? So, as William mentioned, it started back in 98, 99, when the first case of this virus was described, over in Malaysia, right? And then we've had other situations. But after the pandemic, everything, because of what you already mentioned, let's make it clear that this episode is from January 2025, because we've been affected by the trauma that during the pandemic, everything
Would change.
would happen and change completely, right? But according to the WHO, it has pandemic potential because it's a virus with a high fatality rate. So that's a major concern. Wow, right? This ranges from 40% to 75%, and there have even been outbreaks with mortality rates above 90%. It's a virus for which we have no treatment, and it's a virus that is a zoonosis, right? This is the first case, and generally it's directly related to contact with bats. We have a lot of trauma from this, especially from bats, from this deep fear. So we find ourselves becoming extremely alert and very wary. I suppose that
I'll clarify something Hordo mentioned for those unfamiliar with this topic. When we talk about lethality, it's something that kills a lot. When
When we talk about lethality, it's about how many people got sick and how many of those who were sick died. So the mortality, a 50% mortality rate is exceptionally high. For comparison, respiratory viruses like flu or COVID typically have mortality rates of 1% or less. So you can see that's quite a lot. Of course, every time that epidemics begin to spread, we start making more diagnoses. As this denominator, the bottom part of the fraction increases. We often catch cases earlier, often milder cases. Always remember that mortality is highest initially and decreases slightly over time, but it remains an alarming number. With half of those infected dying, this mortality rate is extremely high. So this really is a serious concern, and
as Jordan mentioned, it's not something new. It's not something that someone just made up out of nowhere. Well, it's not something like what you mentioned about your father. I've already heard people saying, oh, they just made this up, another one of those. No, it's not like that at all. This has been documented for quite some time now, and the WHO has already listed it as one of the top 10 priorities for scientific research, patient care, and epidemiological surveillance.
it is crucial for us to understand where this virus originated and whether we should be concerned about it. Our goal is to share how it was described, understand the outbreaks, anticipate what might happen from now on, and clarify the steps being taken by the authorities. And for us to try to do what I call responsible futurology, to try to understand what we think is going to happen. But I think it's important to say, in general, regardless of this virus, it might just be another symptom that there are zoonoses out there. What does that mean? There are infections that are transmitted from animals to humans that are circulating around, and they could indeed be the next problematic virus. That's why we're concerned about this virus. Even with few cases at the moment, it's troubling. Cases pop up here and there, one here, one there. Eventually, it could become more serious. We will explain all of this to you, starting with its history, how it was first described, and what this virus is like.
Today, we clearly know that this infectious virus belongs to the paramyxovirus group of pathogens, right? At other times, we've even talked about, for example, the measles virus, mumps, and parainfluenza. So it has this unique characteristic of being from this group of viruses, which typically have a very significant potential for human-to-human transmission.
Contagious, very contagious.
So it possesses this very specific characteristic, and even though it is primarily classified as a zoonosis, it is already well known by experts that it can also be transmitted directly from one human to another. So this is also one of the concerns. When we are talking about an infection that can be transmitted from human to human, that always ends up being a concern. And as Joel mentioned, I think it's interesting for us to talk about the history of this virus because it was first discovered in Malaysia and what happened. There, during the decade of the 1990s, outbreaks of a supposed viral infection began to occur, which looked very similar to a disease that was already well known.
It seemed very much like Japanese encephalitis. The story is curious because there were a large number of cases. The virus is named after a region called Nipah Bay, which is why it has that name. And it's very interesting because first they noticed more cases. The main group affected were pig farmers, which first drew attention, and they developed encephalitis. What is encephalitis? It's inflammation of the brain, an infection that is usually very serious. All cases of encephalitis are very concerning, right? Regarding encephalitis, it is a serious condition. Other types exist today, but then it was identified as Japanese encephalitis. Pig farmers were affected, leading to an outbreak and several fatalities. The initial suspicion was Japanese encephalitis because it's already something more endemic. There are already outbreaks. And then what happened? They realized that even people vaccinated against Japanese encephalitis were coming down with this new type of encephalitis.
Because what did they start to do? They saw that if you had a virus, the Japanese encephalitis virus is an arbovirus transmitted by mosquito. That's the route of infection transmission. So they started to implement those classic measures, mosquito control, fogging, and it's a disease. Despite available vaccines and vaccination blockades, even so, as João mentioned, the cases...
And it continued on.
As the following months continued to pass by, these cases kept occurring. There was this specific epidemiology related to contact with animals from pig farmers. And one particular detail that really began to draw significant attention was that in the initial studies they observed among the asymptomatic people who had the virus, 1 person out of every 3 developed symptoms, whereas with Japanese encephalitis, the ratio is actually significantly higher. It is 1 in every 300. So there was a much larger number of people who were actually developing clinical symptoms than what was originally expected for this disease.
Infection can be asymptomatic, though it's rare. This is common in arboviral diseases. Like with dengue, many people... I had dengue. It only became symptomatic and severe once. Many others developed encephalitis, which really caught everyone's attention. I've never seen Japanese encephalitis make so many people sick.
And then they started to notice exactly what João mentioned. The problem was that people began to die who had not only been vaccinated, but had received multiple doses of the Japanese encephalitis vaccine. And then some people, including medical doctors, specifically a distinguished professor named Dr. Kolbing Shua from the University of Malaysia, started to seriously consider the possibility, folks, that maybe this virus here isn't actually what we all think it is. And people were telling him, no, it must be Japanese encephalitis, let's keep going. And he said, look, I find this very strange, let me collect some more samples, because if it is Japanese encephalitis, maybe it's not escaping the vaccines, maybe it's a strain, a variant, and I need to study this further. He was smart, right? Because he already gave more... No.
It didn't match what we knew.
That's right. And when he took that specific secretion sample and everything else, putting it under the microscope, he looked closely at it, and what caught his attention was, wait a minute, this doesn't look like a Japanese encephalitis virus. It's killing entirely different cells, just like an essential respiratory virus. And at that very moment, he realized that this was no longer Japanese encephalitis.
And then we discovered that it was an entirely different virus. Not even similar, not even remotely similar.
Exactly not similar.
They aren't even transmitted the same way, which changes the whole game.
And people start telling him, hey, I don't know, you must have contaminated that sample. That's not right. He says, look, so let's do this. I'll take these samples. I'll check if the people who had contact with the virus have antibodies, see if it matches, right? And I'll check if this virus isn't some other virus, if it's not a herpes virus or any other known virus, something already identified.
Known facts.
And he didn't find anything. At that first moment, he couldn't identify any other virus and saw that the antibodies matched. Wait a minute. Everyone is testing positive for the detected virus, and the serology is positive here. Oh, but I really don't know what it is. He takes a sample and goes to the United States. So as a matter of fact, they actually sent him to a specialized facility in Colorado and not in Atlanta, which is the primary headquarters and main center.
Yeah, the classic CDC.
Because what was different there in Colorado was a very large arbovirus department, because people still thought it was, in fact. And when they look under the microscope, the researchers assisting them are like, wait a minute, this is completely different from anything we've ever seen. And that's when they officially discovered this new virus, which was the Nipah virus.
From that region.
The
name, right?
For those who have already seen the movie Contagion, you might know it was actually inspired by real events. Nipah virus is a movie, of course.
As a spillover, it boosts the spread. It increases it a lot, right?
They make up a bunch of stories about it, but it's more or less like that. In the movie Contagion, for those who have seen it, it's a film with Kate Winslet, with Jude Law. It's a cool movie, one of those blockbusters. And it's people all over the world start dying from encephalitis, right? People suddenly experience severe seizures and die, right? And it shows how the virus spreads in the fake news. Watching this movie, if we even look at the COVID pandemic, a lot of things matched up. But when they made the movie, they were inspired by this virus.
So it's really interesting. Once a new virus is discovered, we open up all new possibilities. Could it perhaps be passed along in some other kind of way? Does it work differently? Do the incubation period and characteristics change? Then we must rethink everything. It's not a mosquito bite. Then we discover how this virus is transmitted, which is crucial right now. So we've talked here about transmission between humans, and I'll get back to that in a moment. We should discuss this aspect of zoonosis. What we know, which we didn't know in 1999 and after several outbreaks, is that the virus, one of the main hosts, the reservoir host, is a bat in the region, in Asia. This bat doesn't exist in the Americas. And it's a big bat, a really large bat. The flying fox is a very big bat with huge wings, and it goes there and eats the fruit. He likes fruit. He doesn't bite. He's not a vampire bat. He doesn't attack humans. He's a fruit-eating bat, as they say. He eats fruit. And then, in this business of eating the fruit, this bat contaminates the fruit with its secretions, whether it's saliva, urine, or the bat's feces. And then, when people consume the fruit without washing it, without cleaning it, or eat something like that, they get contaminated. That's how it happens. That it passed from the animal host to humans, and that's probably where the first cases came from before we had human-to-human transmission. And it's interesting because there have even been some outbreaks in Bangladesh, for example, linked to the very specific consumption of a food, which is the date palm tree. People go there and cut the tree and extract that sap from the tree, which is consumed almost like a delicacy, something like that. It looks like sugarcane juice, I even joked. It looks like sugarcane juice, right?
Exactly.
When you cut it and leave a basket for the sap to drip out and collect it later, the bat goes there, eats that sap, and ends up contaminating it. And another thing is the fruit. If the bat eats a fruit or bites into one and contaminates the fruits around it, you can also get contaminated. And then people are used to drinking it raw, straight from the tree, without any kind of pasteurization, boiling, or anything like that. This can be a primary source of transmission from animals to humans and is often considered what we call the natural wild cycle. If we were talking about yellow fever, it would be the wild cycle of yellow fever being caught from bats. So what's the big problem? It's this transmission between humans. And that's what starts to draw attention. These outbreaks drew attention because cases appeared in people who didn't have the expected epidemiological profile, not even dealing with pigs. In those first instances, the pigs probably consumed contaminated food and got infected, and then humans subsequently caught the virus from the pigs. That is another possibility. It came from bats, contaminated food, sickening pigs, and their caretakers. Then people with no direct contact or epidemiological link started getting sick after meeting other patients. This is a major warning sign and a key concern we have with the virus today.
In the movie Contagion, it shows it well at the very end. A bat grabs a piece of fruit, then it falls to a pig. Then there's a guy taking care of the pig there, and so on. Exactly. Then it goes to the meat, to the cook. The cook shakes hands with the woman who gets infected, travels by plane, and
Spreads this infection.
so during those outbreaks, in that first outbreak, they were able to prove it. They found both the antibody and the virus in the pigs, in the fruit, and in the bats from the region, and they managed to establish this epidemiological link. And just as Joel mentioned, it was already known back then that this could be transmitted from human to human, but even so, the infection rate among humans was very low. And to this day, as far as we know, it remains that way.
So, other significant concerns regarding a potential pandemic are that currently in Brazil, there are no bats found with the active virus. But interestingly, when I went to read Up to Date, which is always the very first medical reference we look for when we start studying a new topic, they explicitly mention there that bats have already been identified in Brazil with positive serology for viruses that are very similar to Nipah. They point out that the potential for having reservoirs all over the world is high, so that's why this concern is even greater. Even though there aren't any now, it could happen in the future because of globalization and everything else.
That potential you mentioned is exactly what worries us in a case like this, right? It is like you said, could it be that with some small change, this virus might become better adapted to a bat species that exists somewhere else? These are the concerns we have. So, at some point, this cycle could perpetuate among humans, becoming more contagious from person to person, while also the possibility of it infecting unknown animal species. That's a major concern. We know several human viruses have descended in this way, reaching us like this. HIV itself came from a simian virus. We've heard it 1,000 times, avian flu, Spanish flu, as they say, always showing how a zoonotic disease that jumps from animals to humans can change. It can even adapt so well to humans that it starts spreading from human to human more easily. That's the main concern.
And it's an RNA-based virus, right? We didn't even mention that at the beginning, but RNA has a remarkable capacity for mutation and adaptation. I honestly don't know for sure, right? I'm not a specialist in this field, so I don't know the mutation capacity of this specific virus, but it's something that always captures our attention. And we always get concerned when it's an RNA virus. And another thing that stands out is that in 1998 and 1999, when the first outbreak happened, only zoonotic cases were identified. That was the main form of manifestation. In fact, when we study it, they mentioned the Malaysia strain and the Bangladesh virus. The second outbreak occurred in 2021, which was in Bangladesh. And the clinical characteristics were a bit different. And we already had human-to-human transmission. That was clearly much more significant than the transmission back in 1998. In a short time, there were already major differences. There is also a case from one of these outbreaks, I think it was in 2018, in India itself, where there was a report of a patient who was hospitalized and transmitted the disease to 22 or 23 people who had no epidemiological link or risk related to bats. So it was probably that person who was the source, who transmitted it to more than 20 people. But whenever we talk about this specific topic, it's not a transmission like COVID, right? It's not like someone coughs, gets close, and that's it. They always mention generally close contact. It's people living in the same house or people who are hospitalized in the same hospital bed.
Or who are managing that.
These individuals who are taking care of them, dedicated healthcare professionals. And we always remember that this region we're talking about, Bangladesh and India, are areas with a very high population density, with social conditions significantly different from ours. So this potential for transmission between humans does exist. Yes, it's known, but it's not like a virus. It's not a respiratory virus. Let's put it that way, right? It's not a COVID or an influenza, which are easier to transmit.
You made me remember Ebola when we dealt with Ebola. I don't know if people will remember, but we used to talk about a big problem, which was this. People were in a very poor place with limited access to healthcare. And then there was this thing when someone died, a common funeral ritual was to carry the bodies. And everyone would touch, kiss, and do these kinds of things with the body. So still, they would take an individual who had died from Ebola and everyone would touch, kiss, and hug the deceased. While not universal, this is a practice that occurs in some regions. The foods we mentioned as well can also lead to catching it. For example, an unaware healthcare professional might get infected before realizing the disease was contagious. It's interesting how fast forwarding to today actually makes what we're talking about really make a lot of sense. What do we have today? There are 2 confirmed cases among medical healthcare professionals. And this is the big warning sign that needs to get our attention. If 2 healthcare professionals got sick, they had no epidemiological link, they didn't consume the sap from the date palm, they didn't eat bats, they didn't have those habits, and yet they got sick. Most likely, it's a case of transmission. It was person-to-person spread. They unknowingly infected others. One is in the ICU in serious condition, while the other is stable. That is the current update.
Official January 28th, 6 p.m.
That is exactly right. This is the most recent official information we have. So, João, why did 2 cases become a problem? Because of everything we've talked about so far. So, what's the major concern? It's a potential problem, a potential one. So, I think it's interesting. Why is everyone so alarmed? Because if I discover 2 cases, what do I need to do? Whenever we're talking about new cases, what do we have to do? Testing, isolating those people, and testing the people they've been in contact with. And in this case, the indigenous authority reported 196 people, nearly 200, who had contact with these 2. And what is the big problem? I have to monitor them and find out whether they get sick. These people, they can travel around the world. That's the concern William was talking about earlier, right? It only takes one sick person, a strain, maybe with some mutation, something that's more contagious, to go from somewhere in India to anywhere in the world to a major hub of people. An airport is a major hub of people. This could turn into a more dangerous disease and affect more people. I think that is a significant issue. What's the plan? What are they doing today? They identified those 2, tested all 196 people, and are waiting for the incubation period to end. These people are under observation. They're being monitored. Let's put it that way. So if they get sick, what is the incubation period? In the literature, it's 4 to 14 days, with reports of incubation lasting over 40 days.
Reports say 6 weeks.
6 weeks, which is actually our primary concern. What will these authorities do? They are going to monitor these people and keep an eye on them, marking them so if they travel and develop a fever, they will need to report that they had contact and need testing, and they must be isolated. We are at this stage, which is why airports are on alert, because someone from India could travel to many different places, right?
I think this is clearly like one of the lessons from the pandemic we've just been through, right? And then because of all this alarm with the airport, with testing, with isolation, it's reported so much that I think we end up getting really worried, you know? Like we mentioned here before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there were outbreaks, and the general public never even heard about them, right?
This Nipah virus saw several outbreaks, including one that was year over year even more dangerous.
So that's it. And I think we've covered the history of epidemiology and everything. Let's talk about how the clinical manifestation of the disease is.
Yeah, I think, well, it's important to keep in mind that, as with any viral infection, the initial symptoms you might experience can include headache, muscle pain, and even nausea and vomiting. And these are nonspecific symptoms that can occur with practically any virus. The main distinguishing feature is that it can spread through the central nervous system. From what I saw in the literature, there are documented records that it can infect via the olfactory nerve, and that's why it can ultimately lead to this encephalitis. And it's a virus that is very good at evading our immune system. In other words, it manages to escape the immune response that our body generates, and this leads to an exceptionally high viral load, and this leads you to progress to severe symptoms. In most clinical cases, the severe symptoms will be neurological, which can deteriorate rapidly, such as loss of muscle tone, seizures, and a decreased level of consciousness, which are usually associated with severity. Encephalitis is generally considered severe when it progresses to this stage.
The specific issue of the ocular reflex at hand.
Altered reflexes.
We had very few cases. Now, there are 2, right? In India, hardly anything. But you said there was a time when the respiratory part was more significant.
Right.
It can also have respiratory symptoms. It is often hard to differentiate this virus, for example, from another respiratory virus until it turns into encephalitis and you really suspect something else.
In fact, João, what is also in the literature is that what it seems, right? Everything says it seems because these are outbreaks, so the sample size isn't big enough for us to be sure about what we're saying. But in the cases where there were more severe respiratory symptoms, the transmission was greater from human to human.
So that means maybe there was actually more virus in the respiratory tract, more in the droplets, so it was more contagious.
Indeed.
When the condition suddenly progresses to
Acute brain inflammation,
fewer respiratory symptoms, and more encephalitis occur, as seen in several diseases. This can happen, and slightly more respiratory or intestinal manifestations really do change the transmission. So you see, since there are only 2 cases and very limited information, symptoms are non-specific. That's why, at this stage, epidemiology will play a much bigger role. So when should authorities suspect it? When a patient has a fever or respiratory symptoms, even non-specific ones, and came from these places or had contact with these people. As of today, anyone with Nipah outside India likely had contact with those from the affected region.
exactly.
That's really all there is. For people at home, just relax and be happy, as there's little you need to do right now.
Exactly.
Watch closely what the authorities do. For instance, at airports, there are already alerts if someone who has come from that region arrives. It is just like Ebola in Liberia. Specifically, if a person traveled from that area, you separate and test them, especially if they have any symptoms. We're more or less at that stage. And
What I was going to mention is that the treatment is supportive care. There is no specific treatment, no specific antiviral, and so far, no specific vaccine.
practically speaking, we won't actually have anything. There are some studies with remdesivir and some studies with ready-made antibody cocktails.
The infamous ribavirin.
Ribavirin, which is a non-specific antiviral drug, right?
They're always looking for a place for it, but never find one, right? Less and less.
Of a main player.
Another thing about the clinical picture that I found interesting is that encephalitis, when it happens, often occurs at the end of the first week, around 5 to 7 days. But one thing that can happen is a recurrence or a relapse of the case. The patient may improve, and then after some time, they may have a reactivation of this encephalitis.
It reminds me of measles encephalitis, which is weird because it's delayed like that.
Delayed, yes.
Interesting. So I think that, trying to sum it up, why are we so concerned about what's happening? Because this is a zoonosis, in other words, yet another animal disease that passes to humans, which shows that there is a potential for it to emerge. One fine day, a new virus causing major problems for humanity. That's the concern. That's why we get scared. Is this going to be the virus that causes the problem? Apparently, for now, no. All the outbreaks we've had, despite person-to-person transmission, have been localized outbreaks and have been contained. So far, we haven't seen major outbreaks outside the regions where they first appeared. We have testing available today, which is very good. And we're in a technological phase that's better than in 1999.
There is already a vaccine being developed as well, which is entirely RNA-based, very similar to the Oxford vaccine for COVID. Additionally, remdesivir, which is a medication that was recently approved for COVID. We didn't have it before, so it's already being tested.
We're ahead.
There are also monoclonal antibodies, which seem to be quite promising from what I've seen, and they've already been approved for human testing eventually. The good thing about the WHO being concerned and having it on the priority list is that we can start preparing ourselves. It's as if a major war were coming and we're getting ready, building trenches, manufacturing various weapons just in case it happens. At least we'll have a substantial arsenal from the start, unlike what happened with COVID.
And we are in the phase of testing, rapid identification, testing, and isolation. That's the phase we're in right now. The most important thing for people to understand is rapidly identifying who is sick, testing to confirm or rule it out, isolating that individual, and then closely monitoring their contacts. This is our current phase. So what's our concern, everyone? We all remember COVID. We don't want to reach the point where there is sustained transmission. There is no more epidemiology. In other words, who is getting sick today? It's likely those who had contact with the animal involved in that L cycle transmission. It's wild, like we joked. I touched the animal in food, then got sick. The medic had contact with the sick person, so I know where it came from. We must prevent human-to-human transmission where we ask about contacts and here, I don't know, I was just living normally. I'm not a medic or near anyone sick, yet I'm ill. That is the scenario we must avoid. That shouldn't happen with this virus, and it hasn't happened so far. So the stage we're at now is tracking sick people. That's the phase we're in. For those at home, non-experts or those from outside the area, there is no need to worry. Just stay tuned to the news. What's likely to happen these days is that airports will probably track people who have had contact with this. For now, that's the phase we're in.
What I was going to say is, it's very possible that after this episode we might never even talk about this virus again. But, at least here, an important message remains. which is that concept we've already discussed in previous episodes about One Health, about seeing the world and health as a single entity. There is absolutely no point at all in wanting to close my borders, because today the world is deeply interconnected and highly globalized. The virus does not recognize any physical barriers. It doesn't even have a passport, right? These infections truly have a way of spreading rapidly. And if we don't constantly remain mindful of the fact that what I do here directly impacts the well-being of my neighbor, and what my neighbor does here directly impacts me, this issue will always be a ticking time bomb, and one day we might face something even worse.
There are also much broader issues like deforestation or the situation with bats.
Displace the animals, right?
The bats have to leave the area they're supposed to be in and move to more urbanized areas because of deforestation,
Exactly.
agribusiness, and so on. So it's very complex. There's no point in just coming up with monoclonal antibodies if we're not going to solve the root problem.
Well,
If
you're curious, search for World Flight Map today. It's unbelievable. People are everywhere. Everyone is in contact and crossing paths. It's impossible to separate health in that way.
And finally, there's also the economic issue, even related to livestock, right? To give a specific example, back in the 1990s, those cities in Malaysia that suffered through those severe outbreaks, especially the local people who were raising pork and the farmers who were raising pigs during that period.
It was over, right?
It was over, so there was this social issue. We talked about this in the avian flu episode recently as well.
flu, economic issue.
So it stays like this. The alarm, the guidance. While studying this subject, I found this doctor's story to be truly fascinating. Colby, in Chua. I was even going to mention, we usually don't talk about this, but the first podcast where I heard about this topic was This Podcast Will Kill You, which is an American podcast. If I'm not mistaken, it's episode 140, where they also talk about this subject. So that's my recommendation.
But he was investigating a disease back then,
Back then, exactly.
There was an outbreak, I don't know where. Let's talk about this localized disease outbreak.
Exactly. But I think that's it. We've covered everything. Like it or not, it's an interesting topic.
That's right. And as a final note, folks, we're talking about this because the structure, the way this virus works, is a sign that other viruses can do similar things and become humanity's next big problem. We've heard this before. Originating in animals, a virus mutates, transmits to humans, and then spreads from person to person. This happens with other viruses and causes problems. That's why every time something like this occurs, we keep a close eye on it so it doesn't happen and we can contain this transmission.
I think that's it. Yes.
Well, that is all for today, folks. If you don't follow us on our Instagram page yet, make sure to go follow InfectoCast. If you don't follow us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. We post weekly videos and we share everything about infectious diseases for healthcare professionals. And if you haven't turned on notifications on your podcast app, make sure to do that. Episodes come out weekly. This is InfectoCast. We tell you what no one else does. See you.
All good?
All good.